Passem a la tercera sessió. Em complau poder-vos presentar a Nat Stavens. Té un llarg currículum. S'ha interessat en lingüística aplicada, en adquisició de la llengua, en desenvolupament multilingüe, en aprenentatge de llengües estrangeres, en comparacions lingüístiques, en lectura i escriptura, en aprenentatge de la llengua en etapes infantils, en processos psicolingüístics. S'ha format als Estats Units, a la Universitat d'Illinois, i va presentar una tesi doctoral sobre el tema de l'alternança de llengües en nens trilingües que aprenien simultàniament anglès, castellà i hebreu. Ha tingut ha treballat com a docent en moltes universitats i actualment treballa a la Universitat de Tel Aviv, a la Facultat d'Educació. Ha viatjat, ha estat convidada a diferents llocs en el món hispànic, a Santiago de Xile, a Mèxic, en el món basc. Veig que també a la Universitat de Sant Sebastià, per tant coneix el castellà, coneix i domina muy bien el español, por lo que me parece, por esta larga experiencia. I després té moltes publicacions sobre aquests temes d'alternança de codis. Aquí tinc tota una llista de publicacions, sobretot girant entorn d'aquests temes que acabo d'esmentar. Res més, li dono la paraula. Endavant, adelante.
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 Okay, so good evening to everyone. I hope it's not too late and you're not too tired. Try to make it fast and easy. Gracias for having me here, and thank you for my colleagues that preceded this talk. Unlike my colleagues, you will see through my talk that there are many things that overlap, because after all, we're talking about very similar things, but Hebrew stands out quite differently from the other two languages discussed, and I'll try to illustrate that in some way. Well, needless to say, the previous presenter mentioned that there is an issue of language and identity, and when it comes to Hebrew, that issue is radical and perhaps more extreme than with other languages. For Hebrew is a language, and not every Hebrew speaker is necessarily an Israeli or someone that is identified with a particular nation state. So that already sets the platform quite radically different, and I'll try to lay that out as explicitly as possible. Okay, but before I talk about Hebrew, I tried to do a little exercise. And the idea of this graph was very simple. I went and I Googled the word bilingualism, and I looked at the number of entries for decades for the last century. And we keep on talking about the fact that bilingualism is becoming more the pattern rather than the exception. And there's nothing better than looking at the number of entries. You know, it's trivial, it's not empirical, but it's illustrative of when bilingualism seems to have kicked in the awareness of the world. And just taking it back, the last century has been a challenging time for the flourishing of bilingualism. The world turning into a global village propelled the need to make space and recognize many middle and small-sized language communities, which constitute the new linguistic global environment. In looking at this amateur graph, we see there have been moments in history that have been catalytic in account for bilingualism. The arrows just illustrate some of these events that have led the world to make space and recognize the need for more than monolingual situations. So taking that and having said what I said before, my presentation today is going to be structured as follows. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Hebrew, even though we were explicitly asked not to do that. But in the case of Hebrew, you cannot talk about what Hebrew is today without going back in history, because it has basically no meaning. And I think in general, a language community or people have no present or future if there was no history. So you cannot avoid a people or characterization of people or languages without relating somehow to how they became. Then I'll talk about a crucial issue about Hebrew, which is a revival of the language. I will talk about Hebrew also in relation, not just, as I mentioned before, the fact that it is an issue of identity, because not just it is an issue for the speakers of Hebrew in Israel, but there is a great transnational diasporic community for whom Hebrew is extremely relevant and important. So Hebrew is not limited to borders and to a country like other languages might be. We have a unique situation there. I'll talk about language facts of modern Hebrew and about language policy in Israel at large, and very briefly and a little bit about language policy in education. I do it briefly because I know I will not have time, but I do think, I personally believe that there is no point in talking about a community or language community policy if we don't put our money in education, because these are the generations that will ensure a policy, whichever we decide it to be. Okay. So a very quick sketch of the Hebrew language. The history of Hebrew language is usually divided into 4 major periods: the biblical or the classical Hebrew, which runs until about the 3rd century BC. In most of the Old Testament, where most of the Old Testament was written. The Mishnaic or Rabbinic Hebrew, the language of the Mishnah, a collection of Jewish traditions, was written about 200 after AD, and this form of Hebrew was never used among the people as a spoken language. It was only a written language. Medieval Hebrew followed from about the 6th to the 13th century, and many words then were borrowed from other languages like Greek and Spanish and Arabic, and other languages of the region and contact. And modern Hebrew, the language of Israel in modern times today. Hebrew is one of the world's oldest languages, spoken and written today in much the same way as it was more than 2,000 years ago. After ceasing to exist as a spoken language about 250 BC, it was reborn as a modern language in the 19th century, and today it is the principal language of the State of Israel. It is a Semitic tongue, and it was spoken during the period of migration of the patriarchs into Palestine and remained the language of the Jews throughout the Old Testament period. In the post-biblical period, Hebrew gradually gave way to Aramaic as the spoken language, but continued throughout the centuries to serve as the language of the rituals and prayers. The resistance of Hebrew as a spoken language in the 19th century may be ascribed almost entirely to the efforts of one man by the name of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who devoted his life to the revival of the language and at the same time adapted it for modern use through the introduction of thousands of new words to Hebrew. Hebrew gradually came into use among the Jewish settlers in Palestine and became the official language of the State of Israel and since its creation in 1948. The revival of Hebrew is unique and interesting, and it was gradual. Hebrew began as a diglossic language where we had written Hebrew that was known by all Hebrew not speakers or users, not speakers, and spoken Hebrew that was limited to a certain group, people who could speak it, not necessarily, not only read it and write it. The state of the Jewish nation split with written Hebrew as a unifying force and spoken Hebrew as a divisive force. And this is important, okay, because some people were exposed to Hebrew or proficient with Hebrew only at the writing and reading level, but not at the speaking level, and this extends beyond certain geographical boundaries. The need for a common language for the new homeland was important for the revival of the language. In 1881 and 82, Ben Yehuda begins what was called the Hebrew in Hebrew movement as means to educate people under the ideological credo of Hebrew man speak Hebrew. This movement begins in Europe, okay? In 1889 onwards, the first Hebrew-only school is established, again, in the diaspora, outside what we know today to be Israel. Hebrew slowly penetrates all levels of education from kindergarten to graduation, even in the diaspora. In 1910, young generations who was educated and grew on Hebrew only was getting married and therefore raising their children and in Hebrew and teaching their children in Hebrew. So we were starting to have a first generation Hebrew monolinguals. Modern Hebrew came then, and modern Hebrew is based on the biblical language, as I said before. It makes allowances for innovation to meet modern needs today. We have lots and lots of words that are perfectly adaptable to the new high-tech world. Only colloquial speech is based on the written language, and when we speak, we usually tend to adopt the pronunciation of the Sephardic Jews, the Jews that came from Hispano or Portuguese background, rather than the Ashkenazi Jews, the Jews that came from East Europe origins. The syntax of Hebrew is based on that of the Mishnah. Remember I talked about biblical Hebrew, and then there was another era. So the syntax is based on the second era of the Hebrew language. Use of words, basically Hebrew is highly inflectional. We have a system that has a 3-consonant root that we add to it what we would call vowels, and we can produce a lot of new words or additional words by just using that 3-consonant root, and it's highly productive. So our lexicon can grow through that sort of inflection and production. And the written form, and the writing of Hebrew is from right to left, unlike other languages, and it is a Semitic script, and it consists of 22 letters. We don't have vowels, we only have consonants, and vowels are usually symbols that come underneath those letters, which, by the way, imposes an important issue in education when you try to teach that language to immigrants or to people for whom the vowel consonant system is part of the script or part of the writing system. So, okay. The revival of Hebrew had an impact, a serious impact. According to Shohami, Lana Shohami 2008, she argues that within attempts to revive and preserve endangered languages, the high costs on the individuals result in all kinds of regulations that might be in contradiction to the daily practices and personal beliefs of an individual or a group. This takes us back to the idea that language and ideology and identity, all of that goes together. The need to revive a language is an ideological-driven agenda of a group that may last longer after this revival has been achieved, and such languages are no longer endangered. So to argue that languages have to be revived or maintained because they're endangered, one needs to be very cautious with that, according to Shohami. She further says that there are hidden agendas and overt practices that the revival of Hebrew had. For example, she argues that the hidden agendas were that the language was spoken in Palestine, and it was important for the building of the nation to actually set that as part of an official language. So the language needed to be spoken, and it needed to be spoken in Palestine. So these were hidden agendas, even though not really language policies at the time. The overt practices rendered Hebrew-only policy, which delegitimized the home language of the immigrants, advocating the Hebrew man speak Hebrew approach. Consequently, the idea that maintaining, fostering, encouraging, and worst of all, using another language was regarded detrimental within the scholastic achievement system. This policy was very quickly embraced and institutionalized into the educational programs. Most importantly, this policy was exported by proxy to the Jewish communities outside of Israel as means of facilitating Jewish immigration and settlement in Israel. In fact, for a long time, Hebrew curriculum, material, and teacher training were created in Israel. The Jewish Agency, in collaboration with different institutions and the Ministry of Education, were the authorities in charge of implementing the mechanics of this policy, turning it into scholastic practices that catered to the inclusion of members to the community. So Hebrew was regarded, at least according to Ben Raphael, 94, Hebrew was regarded as a success case of language revival through its status, though its status as an endangered language is pretty much questionable. Some argue that the revival of Hebrew was the result of people gathering and needing a common language of communication, while others argue that Hebrew is not a case of revival, but rather of revernacularization. That's at least according to Ben Raphael. So if we have to sum this, be that as it may, historically Hebrew has gone from being a vernacular language to a liturgical language until the 19th century, when the Haskalah movement in Europe set out to expand traditional Judaism to the secular populace at the service of promoting national ideologies. This is claimed by Ben Raphael and Shohami and Spolsky. These ideologies were reinforced by the revival of Hebrew as a unifying force among the Jewish people in the diaspora. The revival process was completed by 1920, when Hebrew was declared the language of instruction, and the compelling measures towards immigrants to learn Hebrew, even at the expense of their own language, was set foot in 1930. Now this relates to the issue that in addition to the Jews and the citizens of the State of Israel, there were also Jews or language users, Hebrew language users abroad, outside the boundaries or the borders of Israel, creating a situation of transnationalism, diasporic situations, and the concept of homeland. When I talk about transnationalism, I characterize it by what sociologists usually characterize it as a deterritorialization of economic, social, cultural, and political relations. Clearly within that language goes, because it's part of how we define ourselves, who we come in contact, and how we establish our community. It does not depend on distance or borders. That means that we can be a community, a language community, or an identity community that does not necessarily have contacts with the source country, people, homeland of the language. Interactions and relations continue to be developed without international borders, laws, regulations, and national narratives. New readings of past conditions and experiences of migratory flows of diaspora communities change the character of new social community formation. So when we talk about diasporas then, globally dispersed yet collectively self-identified ethnic groups, this is what we had with the Jewish communities outside of Israel. The territorial state and context where such group resided defined those groups more so than their Hebrew. So I have a colleague who is Mexican living in Miami, and she tells me that sometimes it is easier for her to speak to her gardener and to feel at home than to speak to someone in synagogue and to feel part of that community. So there is that sort of feeling that is not taken through or by with the language, but the sense of belonging and participation sometimes works through the language and through the issue of being Jewish, and sometimes it doesn't. Emotional, ideological, and ethnic ties to homeland states and contexts their forebears arrive from. So while in the past the Jewry in the diaspora was much more committed to the homeland, or to what they regarded as the homeland, basically Israel, today is substituted or replaced by the self-sufficiency of transnational communities or transnationalism for the Jewish community. So the world Jewry is a case of transnationalism because their place of origin is marked by the migratory flows. They come from Europe, they come from North Africa, but they live in Latin America, let's say, or they live in America, okay? They shape their communal life in a very different way, following either the local codes or other codes. They build their associational and instructional profile and their collective consciousness as part of a broader feeling of peoplehood. Their feeling of peoplehood and belonging is not restricted to the language. In that sense, language does not always provide them with identity. And they developed a sense of belonging that expressed itself as well through global political interactions. So they expand their interactions beyond just homeland or country of birth and country of residence. Since my colleagues used maps, I was not going to be left without using one. So this arrow here indicates where Israel is and how big it is. We have roughly 7.5 million inhabitants in Israel, of which nearly 76% are Jews or Jewish immigrants, nearly 20% are Israeli Arabs, and roughly 4% are foreign non-Jewish immigrants or workers. Outside of Israel, this is the number of Hebrew users or knowers, Jewish population predominantly, according to the census of 2008. Immigration from the diaspora to Israel pretty much is distributed in this percentage. This is true for 2009. From America and Oceania, we have about 25%. From the former Soviet Union, 41% of our immigrants. From Europe, about 5%. From Africa, about 14%. And from Asia, about 10%. The destiny of Hebrew, or Hebrew in Israel and in the diaspora, is undergoing a major change due to globalization effects. On one hand, modern colloquial Hebrew is drastically impoverished by globalization, losing its authenticity, pure form, and properness. On the other hand, Hebrew is a dynamic communicative system, inevitably must undergo changes according to trends of globalization. This pretty much sits with what Maya was presenting about the traditional approach as opposed to the more, what did you call it, liberal, okay. But I think that all these languages are somehow undergoing this sort of situation. The language policy of Israel today basically establishes two official languages, Hebrew and Arabic, with the mandatory requirement of one foreign language, mostly English, and optional languages, mostly heritage languages. The language policy of the region prior to the establishment of the State of Israel read as follows, and this was something established in 22 by the British Mandate of Palestine, and it says, all ordinances, official notices, and official forms of the government, and all official notices of local authorities and municipalities in areas to be prescribed by order of High Commissioner shall be published in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. And please pay attention to the order of the languages. They are not accidental. There was an amendment with the creation of the State of Israel made to that law, and the amendment said in May 1948, any order in the law which requires the use of the English language is hereby abolished. So you can already see some of the tensions that exist, and back then already how the status of the three languages plays in the language policy of Israel. That is true within the borders of Israel, but there is also a current state of Hebrew outside of Israel by the Jewish communities in the diaspora. The case there is that Hebrew is basically functioning either as an instrumental provides instrumental purposes or heritage purposes. Instrumental purposes basically because people have business, or people want have their spiritual interests and intellectual needs and family and relatives and all kinds of needs like that. And heritage language basically because people still feel that you need Hebrew so that you can pray, and you need Hebrew so that you can belong to the Jewish people. So Israel is multilingualism, whichever way you look at it and from whichever angle you look at it. Israel is complex. It is a multilingual country. It is a multicultural society. We need to keep in mind that Israel, why are you smiling? All the men in the audience. I know, I did it on purpose. Israel is a relatively young country. It seems to be a very old country because we see it with high frequency on CNN. But it's actually a very young country, 60-some years of age. And when you think about it, and all the people that have gathered in Israel, it's inevitable. We are multilingual. This is the texture of the state. I want to show you two examples of how policy, language policy, overt and covert at the national level is manifested. I will first start with this side. This is an official street sign in central Tel Aviv. And you have two signs. This is a modern sign that you can light up at night, and it has the name of the street in Hebrew only, and so this sign is visible at all times. It is central Tel Aviv, an area where the people who frequent that area are mostly Israelis and business people. This other sign that is in the wall is actually written in Hebrew at the top, Latinized in the middle, and in Arabic at the bottom. The order by which these, the labels appear is not accidental. And not only the order is not accidental, but also the name of the street is not accidental, because the name of the street is is on the name of Sir Moses Montefiore, who was a famous British Jew in the 19th century, who was a banker and a philanthropist. And this sign is also evidence of historical events whereby the Hebrew appears, the Latinized form appears, and the Arabic form appears. Unlike the modern sign, this caters to a much broader and wider population that frequented that area in the past as opposed to today. The Arabic, this is an area where Israeli Arabs from the Jaffa area would frequent back in history more often than today. And today we have hardly any tourists in that area, and in the past we had more. So the order of these writings is not accidental, and it's doing something and catering to certain needs and also certain historical facts. The other sign is the sign in my own town, Rehovot, which is central Israel. It is the sign for the Ministry of Immigrant Absorption. And as you can see, it's written in Hebrew, in English, in Russian, in Amharic, in French, and in Spanish. The sign has no Arabic on it, but it's not surprising because Arabs would not go to this office and would not be served by this office. However, next door to this sign is the sign for the Ministry of Building and Constructions, Housing, okay? And that sign is only in Hebrew and English, okay? So that speaks for itself. It's the hidden and the overt and covert agendas. I'm using here Fishman's terms of overt and covert agendas because I think they're very much relevant. Across from these two signs, on the same street, we have these other two signs. And these two signs are no less interesting because they are also overt and covert agendas, only this time it's from the private sector. This sign here is the sign of a dairy product store that is catering primarily the Russian immigrant population in my town. And the sign, I want you to notice, the predominant writing on it is Hebrew, but there is Russian here and no English whatsoever, okay? No Latinized anything except for Hebrew and Russian. About 50 meters down the street, on the same side, there is this eatery that caters the Ethiopian population. It has no business sign on there is no, business sign at the entrance. And it's frequented usually by male Ethiopian males. But on the door to that place, you have a poster announcing a big event of a famous singer, and you have Amharic written here, and you have Hebrew written here, almost in equal proportions. This also speaks not only for the representation of language and the languages of these people in the public space, but these signs in the private sector are also a manifestation of how these small communities or minorities, if you wish, see themselves in relation to the majority. So Israel's language policy must provide for all languages of Israel today. And if you thought that the cases that we saw before were extremely variant with languages, Hebrew in Israel is the principal language. It's spoken by most people. Arabic is the second official language. It's the medium of instruction in the Arabic sector of public schools and the heritage language of Jews from Arabic countries, Arabic-speaking countries. English is the major foreign language. Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Tat, Judeo-Berber are endangered Jewish languages brought by immigrants primarily from the northern part of Africa and Ladino from this region, and Yiddish, of course, from East Europe. Russian, Polish, Hungarian, English, French, and Amharic, and Tigrinya, some of the community languages of the immigrants, the small communities or large minorities. French, German, and Japanese are popular languages taught in schools. Armenian, Assyrian, or Aramaic, and Circassian, some of the community languages of the non-Jewish population in Israel. So as you can see, you can imagine with all of this variety, educational system, language policy must take care of all of this. And the question is that possible? Well, not quite. Language education policy in Israel, there was no such thing until 1995. In 1995, Spolsky and Shohami, people that some of you might know, have gathered together to establish the first Language Policy Institute that was funded for only 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. And in those 3 years, they managed to put together some recommendations for the Ministry of Education in regards to what language policies should be in the educational system. Those recommendations were circulated in a Director General's circular to the schools, but there has been no serious implementation of that. There has been a lot of inertia implementation, but not really serious implementation. So the policy that they proposed provided for basically 3 things: mother tongue teaching, second language teaching, and foreign language education. In terms of mother tongue teaching, the policy establishes literacy goals in Hebrew and in Arabic as mother tongue in the 2 major sectors, the Jewish and the Arab. It makes provision further for language maintenance in the language of immigrants with special reference to Russians and Ethiopians. There is a long-established policy permitting immigrant students and students who have been overseas for a longer period to take school leaving examinations in any language they choose to. The second language education policy stresses and makes provisions for teaching of Hebrew to immigrants for 1 year and for developing literacy in that language. Within the Arab sector, there is provision for the teaching of Hebrew, optionally in the 1st grade and compulsory from the 2nd grade until the 12th. For speakers of Hebrew, Arabic is a required subject from 7th to 10th grade, and it becomes optional in 5th, 6th, or 11th and 12th grade. Schools may choose, however, to offer French instead of Arabic, and new immigrants are exempted from the requirements. They can follow their heritage language. Foreign language education, primarily English, is considered to be the first language. English is considered to be the major foreign language. It's provided in the schools as an option from 3rd and 4th grade, but it becomes compulsory afterwards for the entire school duration. While the policy mentions French as an option instead of English, both popular sentiments and university entrance requirements pretty much cut the cake in favor of English. French is recognized as important because of cultural, political, and economic ties and the community language of a sizable body of immigrants, and it's taught optionally from the 5th to the 12th grade. Russian is offered as an optional language for new immigrants throughout the system. Bless you. The policy encourages students to also study a 3rd language in which there exist programs are languages such as Yiddish, Ladino, Spanish, and German. The policy seeks to add constantly new languages, so we are seeing lately Japanese and Chinese being a hot thing for kids in school. The new policy also encourages the development of special language schools. There is much more about the educational language policy, and there is much more about provisions that are made at the scientific arena in Israel. The scientific arena, which was mentioned by my colleagues before, is conducted primarily in English because, as Maya said, if you don't publish in English, you don't get as much recognition as if you publish in English and expose and get the citation index high and so on and so forth. So it's not really just a matter of the country or the language, but it's really a matter of the academic community worldwide, okay? So there are many more issues that I presume we will continue discussing tomorrow. And meanwhile, I wish you well, and thank you.